and welcome to another Bible study. And today we are on Genesis 4, and this is the Cain and Abel story. This is one of those stories where things go sideways really quick. And so if you've already read it, maybe you've already got some questions, or you're listening to this before you read it and going, all right, what are some things to be looking for in this story? And one of the things to notice about this story is, first, it's written in the J tradition. And the J tradition is the early monarch period, so 10th century to 9th century. And this is going to be very important for this story because that is during a time where, if the author is writing with the knowledge of what's happening with King David, whether that's during his reign or after, this story is going to play an important role because during King David's reign, which you can read about throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, but this particular part is found in 2 Samuel 13. It's where King David has a son named Amnon, and Amnon sexually assaults his daughter Tamar, and his other son Absalom decides to take matters into his own hands because David finds out and doesn't do anything. And so Absalom kills his brother Amnon. And so that's one of the important stories to note. Another important story related to King David is that King David is chosen as king, and he's not the oldest in the family. And when his son Solomon is chosen to be the next king, that Solomon is also not the oldest. And so there's something about the second born, and we're going to see that actually throughout the book of Genesis. So that's very important to understand. And that another just kind of tidbit just to take note of with this J source, this J tradition, is that David creates music, and he's from the line of Seth, which is going to get mentioned at the end of Genesis 4. So some things of thinking further down the line, of looking at further things that actually are going to pull on this Genesis 4 passage or helps people to understand it a little more. A couple of words to note in the Genesis 4 passage. Cain means spear, and that Abel means transitory, vapor, vanity, or nothing. It's kind of interesting to think about what Cain means and what Abel means. Again, there is nothing geographical or archaeological that we have from this time period. Some interesting things to note as you read through. First is that in the Garden of Eden, humans become alienated from God by their actions. And in this story of Cain and Abel, it's kind of one of those moments of going, all right, so they've already become alienated from God. And in the Cain and Abel story, it becomes division and alienation from one another. That humans now are starting to drive wedges between themselves. Also to note is that God does not ask for the sacrifice or any sacrifice at this point. In fact, sacrifices are not discussed until much later with the Israelites, and only become, especially with the temple, this is what you must do with making sacrifices, offerings to God. And so it's kind of interesting to think about this Genesis 4 passage as God didn't ask. Nowhere in the text does it say that God asked for a sacrifice. And here Cain and Abel show up with their sacrifices. Cain showing up with grain because he's a farmer of the land, and Abel showing up with an animal because he is the tender of the livestock. And so as we are going through this, debate actually enters in as to why. Why was Cain's sacrifice not as favorable as Abel's? Is it God favors grain or favors animals over grain? Well, that doesn't make much sense because later we will read about how actually grain was an acceptable thing to sacrifice, to offer to God. We also get this interesting passage in Isaiah 1. And you can look at verses 11 through 17. And it's a moment where God's like, I don't want any of the animal sacrifices. And so one of the interpretations then becomes that Cain's sacrifice, Cain's offering, isn't seen as favorable because Cain chose not to live faithfully by doing justice. That when they show up, it's actually their hearts about what they're sacrificing, why they're sacrificing, what they are offering. And in this moment that Cain's showing up maybe just because his brother is, that there's something about the way Cain is showing up that actually makes his offering less favorable. And that even after this has gone kind of sideways of Cain's is not seen as favorable, it's God, and God actually encourages Cain to choose a different way, that don't choose the anger and the resentment. And that God warns that allowing the anger and resentment to go unchecked can result in actions that aren't right. And so God gives that guidance, God gives that warning, and Cain decided not to heed the guidance. Cain decided to give in to anger and resentment, which then leads to him killing his brother Abel. And it's this moment where God asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And Cain responds that, "Who am I? Am I my brother's keeper?" And so he actually uses excuses and lies to cover his tracks. That once again, just as his parents didn't take responsibility in the garden and they started to play the blame game, Cain also is refusing to take responsibility for his actions. And this is also a moment to recognize of the choice. We talked about that in Genesis 3. There's always a choice, but there are also consequences for those choices. And so here we are getting, there are consequences for Cain's choices, for Cain deciding he'd rather sit in the anger and resentment instead of trying something differently. And that maybe Cain was jealous of his brother Abel. We don't exactly know, but he chooses a path that ends up with him now being thrown out away from his family, that he's got to be a wanderer. And what's interesting is he's now fearful that he is going to die, that somebody is going to kill him. And so God gives the assurance of, no, nobody's going to do that to you. I'm going to make sure to protect you, which is kind of an interesting thing, that God's love even is still present with Cain. That even though Cain has done this atrocious act against Abel, that God's love is still present and still trying to guide and still trying to protect, of going, you can live a little bit differently. And so as Cain leaves, he goes out and now he lives with he finds a wife amongst the people that are out there and builds a city with others. That Cain is actually giving us an example of urbanization, of that there are other people present, and people may go, well, who are these people? What's important to note is, again, back to writing during the monarchy period of David, King Solomon, that the Shea tradition is actually trying to give a sense of where did the Israelite people come from? And so the Israelite people come from Cain and Abel. It's this, or from Adam and Eve, and then you get Cain and Abel, but then they don't live up to. Cain goes off to do his own things. He has his own lineage, which you read about. And then we get Adam and Eve having another child named Seth. And that is where then the Israelite people come through. And so it's just kind of this interesting storyline of looking at, all right, where do the Israelites come from? And what happens to Cain? And so you get that in chapter 4. What's also kind of curious to note about chapter 4 with Cain's genealogy is that it leads not only to cities being built, but also to the arts of music, of blacksmiths, of workers of bronze and iron. And so building community, building, cultivating, creating beauty and art and good things can still happen even out of tragedy. But humans have to choose whether or not to do the right thing, to do the good thing. And so it's a sense here of going, yes, this was awful what Cain did, But there's always a choice of what can be done next. Of, all right, so you've done this terrible thing. There are consequences that he's going to have to live with. But at the same time, you can also build up community. You can change the course of your life. You can change the direction and do good things. And so there are good things that come from Cain's line. Like, it's not just written off for all time. And that creation continues even in the midst of tragedy, whether that's through the line of Seth with, again, the Israelite line, or even the creation of the arts and of music, that can be important even in the midst of tragedy. And so what are some of the things that this text is trying to convey? In the Garden of Eden, humans were alienated from God by their actions. So now with this story, humans now further alienate themselves from one another. That when we hurt one another, when we cause each other pain in extreme manners and even in lesser manners, it's like this wake up of going, we are hurting and we are alienating, we are dividing ourselves. And so that's part of what this story is conveying. Something else the story is trying to convey is that family dysfunction is on full display. That to the earliest of times, there has always been family dysfunction. No one's family is perfect. And so maybe we need to hear that yes, dysfunction happens, but we have a choice as to how we deal with it, how we navigate it, how we go through with it. And then the story also highlights two lines of care. One is for the animals, the herdsmen, and a line for those tending the land, the farmers. Another thing that it's trying to convey is that there's always a choice and there will always be consequences. God protects Cain even as Cain lives with the painful consequences of his actions. There is always a choice. And so what are we willing to choose? What do we need to choose? And then one can also learn from the story of Cain in ways that the community continues to be cultivated, beauty is created, or we can choose a different path, like Lamech, that continues to perpetuate killing and revenge. So even in Cain's line, you get one who continues to perpetuate killings and awful things, and then you get others who are like, you know what? No, I'm going to create something beautiful in this world. And so to recognize that no matter what's happened in the past, that there's always a choice to do something different going forward. And that human life, the passage is trying to convey that human life from the earliest of times is complex. And that the things that we sometimes do and say get in the way and are highly problematic. And so to be careful with those words and those actions. When we think about the overall purpose of Genesis 4, we can understand it as the writer and the editors, they've created a chapter that charts the beginning of human reproduction, murder, revenge, nomadism, urbanism, music, metalworking, and religion. Like everything gets thrown into this chapter because we are complex beings and we are a mixed bag. There are sometimes some really good things, and at other times there are some things where we're like, ooh, maybe not so good. So I hope that this has been helpful in reading through chapter 4 of Genesis, of the story of Cain and Abel. And if you haven't read it, I am now going to read it, or if you want to go read it yourself, that's great. But here is the reading of Genesis 4. The man Adam knew his wife Eve intimately. She became pregnant and gave birth to Cain and said, I have given life to a man with the Lord's help. She gave birth a second time to Cain's brother Abel. Abel cared for the flocks and Cain farmed the fertile land. Sometime later, Cain presented an offering to the Lord from the land's crops, while Abel presented his flock's oldest offspring with their fat. The Lord looked favorably on Abel and his sacrifice, but didn't look favorably on Cain and his sacrifice. Cain became very angry and looked resentful. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why do you look so resentful? If you do the right thing, you won't won't you be accepted? But if you don't do the right thing, sin will be waiting at the door ready to strike. It will entice you, but you must rule over it. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." When they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian?" The Lord said, "What did you do?" "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. You are now cursed from the ground that opened its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. When you farm the fertile land, it will no longer grow anything for you, and you will become a roving nomad on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Now that you've driven me away from the fertile land and I am hidden from your presence, I'm about to become a roving nomad on the earth, and anyone who finds me will kill me." The Lord said to him, "It won't happen. Anyone who kills Cain will be paid back 7 times. The Lord put a sign on Cain so that no one who found him would assault him. Cain left the Lord's presence and he settled down in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife intimately. She became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain built a city and named the city after his son Enoch. Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad fathered Majuel. Majuel fathered Methuselah, and Methuselah fathered Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives, the first named Ada and the second Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who live in tents and own livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of those who play stringed and wind instruments. Zillah also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the ancestor of blacksmiths and all artisans of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Listen to my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. I killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. So Cain will be paid back 7 times and Lamech 77 times. Adam knew his wife intimately again, and she gave birth to a son. She named him Seth, because God has given me another child in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. Seth also fathered a son and named him Enosh. At that time, people began to worship in the Lord's name." May your day be blessed.